For almost 3 years, the third Saturday of every month belonged to my husband Mark's mother. That was how I understood it. My husband would be up before the alarm, moving quietly through the kitchen, leaving by 7 with a canvas bag and a thermos of chicken soup he'd made the night before. Deliberate, unhurried, the way a man moves when a thing has become ritual. He told me once, nursing home food is terrible. And later, she gets confused with new people. The environment upsets her, residents wandering, television's too loud. I had been to a place like that with my grandmother. I didn't push. I stopped offering to come. I had built a full picture in my mind. My mother-in-law rose at Greenbrook, 40 minutes north. A room with a window. A crossword puzzle. A nurse checking in at mealtimes. Someone cared for, somewhere safe. My husband said he had placed his mother in a care facility. But the monthly payments hadn't left our account in 3 months. The third Saturday of December was our neighborhood potluck. The house was warm, full of neighbors. My husband stood by the fireplace with Jim Miller. I was refilling wine glasses when the doorbell rang. I opened the door. It was my mother-in-law. She was standing in the snow in a coat too thin for December. White hair, a plastic grocery bag in one hand, apples, crackers, a small carton of juice. Her eyes closed for just a moment. "I'm so sorry to come like this." Her voice was quiet, but the room heard every word. "Mark said I couldn't come here yet." A pause. "But I ran out of heating oil 2 days ago." The room went silent behind me. I turned and found my husband across 30 feet of our perfect home. His face had the look of something completely emptied. "She was never at Greenbrook," I said. He didn't answer. My mother-in-law was never in a care facility. For 3 years, my husband had been lying to me. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. That night, my husband knelt at his mother's feet and said, "I couldn't look at you and see death, Mom." He had been hiding both of them. From the truth. From each other. What happens to a family that finally stops pretending? The alarm never needed to be set on the third Saturday of the month. Mark Sullivan was already awake before the first pale light edged through the bedroom curtains. Lying still with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling the way a man stares at something he'd rather not see. The house was quiet around him, the particular quiet of a suburb that had settled into its weekend, where the only sounds were the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the low, mechanical rumble of a garbage truck making its early rounds somewhere down the block. Naperville in November had a way of holding its breath between dawn and sunrise. As if the whole town were bracing itself, waiting, suspended in the gray space before the day made any demands. He eased out of bed without waking Laura. That part was habit now. 3 years of third Saturdays had trained him. He moved through the master bedroom in the dark, avoiding the third floorboard from the door, the one that groaned if you stepped on the left edge, and made his way down the hallway with the careful, deliberate quiet of a man who had learned to disappear without leaving a mark. The kitchen was cold. He hadn't turned the heat up yet. He stood at the counter for a moment, feeling the chill seep through his socks and up into his ankles, before reaching into the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulling down the small plastic caddy he kept tucked behind Laura's binders of recipes she clipped from magazines and never quite got around to making. It was unremarkable looking, translucent blue, the kind you could buy at any pharmacy for $3, wedged between the blood pressure monitors and the reading glasses display. But his hands were already trembling when he opened it. 7 small compartments. He'd labeled them himself, in his own careful handwriting, the same precise lettering he used on logistics manifests at work, everything accounted for, every detail in its column. He lined the medications up on the counter one by one, the small white tablet for blood pressure, the oblong yellow one for arthritis, the robin's egg capsule for the inflammation in her left knee that flared up whenever a cold front moved through. He worked methodically, unhurried, filling each compartment with the focused attention of a man performing a ritual. He does not allow himself to examine too closely. Rushing felt like admitting what this was. Slowing down felt like the only way to keep doing it at all. He clicked the last compartment shut and set the organizer on the counter beside the stove. Outside the kitchen window, a gray squirrel ran the length of the back fence. paused at the corner post, and vanished into the oak tree that had been growing in their yard since before they bought the house. Mark watched it for a moment. The yard was tidy. Laura kept it that way even in November, the flower beds banked with fresh mulch. The bird feeders filled, the patio cushions stored in the garage on the first weekend of October without fail. Everything in its place. Everything looked after. It was the kind of yard that told the neighbors something, and the neighbors had always been told the right things. He turned away from the window. His briefcase sat by the door where he'd left it Friday evening. He unsnapped the clasps and lifted the top, reaching past the rubber-banded folders of carrier contracts and distribution reports to the slim envelope he'd tucked flush against the inside. Lining Friday afternoon, intercepted from the mailbox before Laura got home. The return address was the Social Security Administration, printed in the small, businesslike font of an agency that does not soften its language. The letter inside was 2 short paragraphs, brief and factual in the way government correspondence always was. As if the people writing it understood that the people reading it already knew what they'd done. It explained that the automatic payment associated with Rose Sullivan's current residence had been flagged due to an address discrepancy. And that the monthly rent for the apartment on Clover Street was now overdue. 2 months overdue, as of this notice. Mark read it again, though he already had it memorized, the way you reread something. Hoping the words will have arranged themselves differently since the last time. They hadn't. He refolded it along the same creases, fit it back into the envelope, and buried it beneath the manifests. Then he stood at the open briefcase for a moment with his hand resting on the folders, and the kitchen was very quiet, and he was very still. He told himself this was temporary. He had been telling himself that for a considerable while. By 7:15, he was dressed and carrying a canvas bag to the car. Inside the bag the pill organizer, a sealed container of chicken soup. He'd made from scratch the previous evening a recipe his mother had taught him, onions and celery and a bay leaf. The kind of thing you make when you cannot bring yourself to do the harder thing, a paperback mystery from the used bookstore on Main Street, and a folded newspaper. Because she still did the crossword and pen, stubbornly, the way she'd done every Sunday morning when he was a boy, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, stealing pieces of her toast. He set the bag in the passenger seat. Not the back. He didn't like putting it in the back. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir. The man 2 houses down was walking his retriever. A teenager was dragging a recycling bin to the curb in pajamas and unlaced boots, squinting against the cold. The Millers across the street had their lights on, the blue flicker of an early television visible through the living room shears. Everything was ordinary. Everything was its recognizable self. Mark lifted a hand to the retriever man, who lifted one back, and pulled slowly onto the street. He drove for 11 minutes in the direction of the care facility on Greenbrook Road. Then he turned left instead of right. The park was about 4 miles from the facility, a long rectangle of public green space running alongside a man-made lake. The kind of suburban park built for joggers and families and weekend picnics that nobody was having in November. The picnic tables were still up, their wood darkened by rain. A small band of Canada geese that had not bothered to migrate moved along the water's edge with the unhurried certainty of animals that have nowhere more pressing to be. The trees at the path's edge were bare, their branches thin against the gray sky. Mark pulled into the gravel lot at the far end and cut the engine. He had first come here 3 years ago, on the afternoon he was supposed to check his mother into Greenbrook. He'd driven all the way to the facility's parking lot. He'd gotten out of the car and walked to the entrance, where the automatic doors had slid open and the smell had come out to meet him. Antiseptic and cafeteria and something else underneath it, something he couldn't name but recognized, the smell of time running out in institutional quantities. In the lobby, he'd seen an elderly woman in a wheelchair being pushed by a staff member who was looking at her phone. The woman in the wheelchair was looking at the window. Not at anything outside it. Just at the glass. Mark had walked back to his car and driven to this park and sat until the afternoon light turned the color of old brass. He had never told Laura. He'd meant to. He'd meant to sit with her that evening at the kitchen table. And explain that he hadn't been able to go through with it, that he needed more time, that he'd find another arrangement. But when he'd come home and seen the careful way she'd set the table and the expression she wore when she was bracing herself for something difficult, a look of gentle preparation that he'd always found quietly devastating, something in him had shut like a lock. "She's adjusting," he'd said. "These transitions take time." And Laura had exhaled with relief, and he had taken that relief from her and used it to build something. Carefully, brick by careful brick, over the months and then the years that followed. Now he sat in the gravel lot with the pill organizer in the canvas bag and the soup going cold on the passenger seat. He watched the geese move along the waterline. He watched the bare trees stand there in their patience, which was not the same thing as his patience, not at all. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there. "I'm just protecting the life we built," he said quietly. The words had worn smooth by now. 3 years of third Saturdays had done that. They came out easily, the way old habits come out without friction, without resistance. Landing in the cold air of the car's interior and meaning almost nothing at all. He sat for 38 minutes. Then he drove to the apartment on Clover Street, because whatever else he was becoming, he was still her son. The soup was still warm. The crossword would not fill itself, and neither would the pill organizer she always left on the kitchen windowsill. So she'd remember to take them with her morning coffee. He took the canvas bag from the passenger seat and walked up the exterior staircase of the 2-story building with the peeling trim. The one on the corner of Clover and Marsh where the streetlight had been burned out since September. He let himself in with his key. She was at the table in her housecoat, her coffee cup empty, the previous week's crossword already finished and set aside. "You're late," she said, without looking up from the window. "Traffic," he said. She said nothing else, and he put the soup on the stove, and the morning light came. Pale and thin through the apartment's single east-facing window, and Mark Sullivan moved around his mother's small kitchen with the practiced ease of a man performing a kindness he had also made a crime. And the rent notice sat buried in his briefcase in the parking lot below, and neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them said anything at all about the things that mattered. Laura Sullivan had a habit of checking pockets before she ran a load of laundry. It wasn't suspicion that drove it not originally. It was practicality, the kind of domestic thoroughness that accumulates over 23 years of marriage, of finding receipts balled up in jeans pockets and guitar picks lodged in the corners of Mark's work slacks and, once, memorably, a folded $30 bill tucked into the breast pocket of a blazer that had gone unchecked for 2 months. She'd framed that one as a joke. Found money, she'd called it at the dinner table. Mark had laughed. That was the kind of household they ran. Warm, functional, a little cluttered around the edges, but solid in the way that things are solid when 2 people have chosen each other long enough to become architecture for one another. Weight-bearing walls in a structure. Neither of them examines too carefully because it is standing and that seems like sufficient evidence. She was sorting the Saturday laundry Mark had left early, as he always did on the third Saturday when she found it in the back pocket of the slacks he'd worn Thursday. Not a receipt, not a guitar pick, a Medicare card. She held it up to the light coming through the laundry room window. The name on it was clear enough: Rose Eleanor Sullivan. The card itself was standard, the usual government issue white laminate, but what caught her attention was the sticky note attached to the back: orange, the size of a matchbook. With 3 words written in a handwriting she didn't recognize: account frozen. D. Laura stood in the laundry room for a long moment. She turned the card over twice, as if the back of it might offer a different reading. It didn't. She peeled the sticky note off carefully, set it on the dryer, and looked at both items separately. A Medicare card, a note about a frozen account. In her husband's pants pocket. On an ordinary Thursday. She told herself there was probably an explanation. She put the laundry in the wash and went to the kitchen table with her laptop. It took her less than 15 minutes to find what she was looking for, or rather, to find what she was not looking for. She'd been managing the household accounts since the previous spring, when Mark had asked her to take over the bill payments because his logistics work had ramped up and he was traveling more. She knew their account structure. She knew their recurring expenses. What she did not know, until she pulled up 2 months of statements side by side and went through them with the same methodical attention she brought to her counseling case files, was what was missing. The Greenbrook Care Facility charge $4,000 monthly, drawn on the 15th, was not there. She went back 3 months. 4, 5, not there, not there, not there. Not once in the last 7 months had that charge appeared on any account she had access to. She checked the secondary account, the one they'd opened years ago for regular expenses. She checked the joint savings. She sat very still at the kitchen table while the washing machine ran in the other room. And the November wind pressed against the kitchen window, and the neighborhood beyond it went about its Saturday in complete ignorance. I told myself Mark had everything under control. That was the thought she kept returning to. It was the thought she examined from multiple angles, the way she examined the thoughts of the clients she saw in her counseling office. With patience, with a willingness to sit with discomfort, with the professional understanding that the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love are often the last fictions we're willing to surrender. She had trusted his calm. She had trusted the way he'd talked about Greenbrook, the staff, the common room, the garden view he'd said his mother loved. She had trusted the third Saturday, and the canvas bag, and the way he came home. Those evenings looking wrung out and distant in the way that people look when they've done something emotionally difficult and don't quite know how to re-enter ordinary life. She'd read all of it as grief. As a son processing something hard. The silence in the house had started to feel like a scream. She picked up her phone and found the number for Greenbrook Care Facility online. It rang 3 times before a woman answered with the practiced warmth of a front desk accustomed to fielding concerned families. Greenbrook, this is Peggy. Hi, Peggy, my name is Laura Sullivan. I'm calling about a resident, Rose Sullivan? She would have been admitted about 3 years ago. A brief pause. The sound of keys. Could you give me the date of admission, ma'am? Laura gave the date. The date Mark had driven away with the canvas bag the very first time. The date he'd come home that evening and told her Rose was adjusting. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm not showing a Rose Sullivan in our records, Peggy said. Her voice had shifted, carefully neutral, the way voices become when they sense they're delivering news someone wasn't expecting. We don't have a current resident by that name, and our records don't show a past admission either. Is it possible she was placed at a different facility? No, Laura said. I don't think so. I'm sorry I can't be more help. If you'd like, I can give you the number for our admissions office, they could double check. That's okay. Laura heard her own voice from a distance, calm and even, the counselor's voice she used when she needed to hold herself together in order to think clearly. Thank you, Peggy. She ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the wind lifted a scattering of dead leaves from the flower bed and carried them across the yard. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder, bright red against the gray, ate 3 seeds, and flew away. The washing machine completed its cycle and clicked into the spin. Laura did not move for a long time. She was not, by nature, a woman given to catastrophizing. 20 years as a counselor had taught her to resist the pull of worst case thinking, to hold space for ambiguity, to ask the next clarifying question before drawing conclusions. She understood, in a professional and deeply personal way, that people were capable of extraordinary compartmentalization. Of carrying 2 entirely separate versions of their lives in adjacent rooms of themselves, letting neither version hear the other. She understood it clinically. She had not, until this moment, understood what it felt like to be standing outside those rooms. She opened the laptop again and pulled up the statements. She went back further, this time 18 months, then 24. She built a picture the way she helped clients build pictures, piece by piece, looking for the shape that the missing pieces made. What she found was a pattern of cash withdrawals on the second Friday of every month. Not large enough to be alarming in isolation. $300, $400, sometimes $250. Consistent, quiet, the kind of thing you'd overlook in a busy household unless you were specifically looking for it. She wrote the amounts down on a notepad in a column and added them up. The total looked back at her from the page. She thought about the Medicare card in Mark's pocket. The note about the frozen account. The facility that had never heard of Rose Sullivan. The 3 years of third Saturdays. The way he described Greenbrook, the staff, the common room, the garden view. She thought about the particular quality of his voice when he talked about his mother. A controlled, careful quality, like a man carrying something fragile through a crowded room. She had always read it as love seasoned with sadness. She was not, now, entirely sure what she was reading it as. She folded the notepad in half and tucked it into her cardigan pocket. She put the Medicare card in her cardigan pocket alongside it. She got up and moved to the window and stood looking out at the yard, the tidy beds. The full feeders, the oak tree they'd planted together when they bought the house, now taller than the roofline. She thought, I have been living in this house with someone I may not fully know. And then, because she was Laura Sullivan, and because the harder truth was often the more useful one, and whatever is happening, his mother is in the middle of it. The washing machine finished its spin cycle. In the sudden quiet, she could hear the house settling around her, the small creaks and adjustments of an old structure shifting with the cold. She listened to it for a moment. Then she went to the dryer, transferred the laundry, and began folding things with steady hands, and waited for her husband to come home. And said nothing, and kept the notepad in her pocket all day, and when Mark walked in that evening, looking wrung out and distant, she kissed him on the cheek and asked if he was hungry and watched him move through the kitchen that she had just seen very clearly for the first time in 3 years. She watched him the way you watch something you are no longer entirely certain of. Not with anger, yet. Anger would come later, in its own time. What she felt right now was quieter and harder than anger, the deep, unsettling recognition that the solid thing you have been standing on is not, perhaps, as solid as it appeared. And outside, the November evening came down fast and dark over the yard. And the cardinal was gone from the feeder, and the dead leaves gathered in the corners of the flower beds, and the house kept its secrets the way it always had. The Millers had started the neighborhood potluck tradition 11 years ago, and by now it had become one of those events that nobody quite remembered. Deciding to continue, but everyone showed up for anyway, the way certain things become permanent simply by not being stopped. It happened the first Saturday of December, rotating among 6 households on their block, and this year it was the Sullivans' turn. Laura had known for weeks that it was coming. She'd planned the menu in October: a slow cooker beef stew, a pan of cornbread, one of those cranberry walnut salads that Mark never ate but everyone else always asked about. She had pulled out the good table linens. She had arranged the dining room with the quiet, competent attention she brought to anything she decided to do well. What she had not done, in the 3 weeks since finding the Medicare card, was say anything to Mark. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She had told herself she needed more information. Both things were true, and neither was the complete truth. The complete truth was that she had been watching her husband, carefully and without expression, for 21 days. And she had not yet found the angle from which the picture made sense. As a counselor, she knew that confrontation before comprehension was rarely useful. As his wife, she knew that some part of her was still hoping, with a hope she recognized as fragile and perhaps naive, that there was an explanation she hadn't thought of yet. By 7 in the evening, the house was full. The Millers had come first, as they always did, Jim carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a towel and Janet bearing a bottle of wine, in the energy of a woman who considers social events a competitive sport. The Garcias from the corner brought tamales that disappeared within 12 minutes of their arrival. The Hendersons came with their teenage son, who immediately located the furthest corner of the living room and remained there for the duration. The younger couple who'd moved in 2 summers ago, the Okafor Prestons, brought a gorgeous sweet potato pie that became an immediate subject of conversation. The house was warm and lit and full of the particular noise of people who know each other well enough to be comfortable, but not well enough to be entirely honest, which is perhaps the defining characteristic of neighborliness. Laura moved between rooms with glasses of wine and conversation, and she was good at it. She was always good at it, smiling at the right moments, laughing with genuine warmth when Janet Miller told the story about the Christmas wreath disaster for the 4th year running. Mark stood by the fireplace with Jim Miller, talking in the easy, circular way of men who'd run out of new things to say to each other but find the repetition comfortable. From across the room, she watched him. He looked like himself. He looked like a man completely at ease in his own house, among his own neighbors, at the center of an ordinary life. And that, she thought, setting a wineglass down on the side table with a care that she did not feel, was what 3 years of sustained deception looked like from the outside. It looked like nothing at all. The doorbell rang at 7:43. She would remember the time because she glanced at the clock on the mantel at that exact moment, prompted by some instinct she couldn't have named. Mark was mid-sentence about a Bears game. Jim Miller was nodding. The house was at its warmest, its fullest, its most arranged. The doorbell rang again, then again, not impatiently, insistently, the way someone rings when they're not certain the first ring was heard, when they really need the door to open. Laura set down her wine and went to the door. She opened it. Rose Sullivan stood on the front porch in a winter coat that was not heavy enough for the temperature outside, her white hair dusted with snow from the walk up the front path. She was holding a plastic grocery bag in her left hand, apples, a box of crackers, a small carton of orange juice, the improvised provisions of someone making do. Her face was pale, and her cheeks were red from the cold. And there was snow on her shoulders, and her expression, when she saw Laura, shifted through several things in quick succession. Relief, and then embarrassment, and then the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that whatever happens next, she will face it standing upright. Behind Laura, the living room had gone quiet. "I'm so sorry to bother you, sweetheart," Rose said. Her voice was composed, but there was a tremor underneath it that Laura recognized immediately, not weakness, but the effort of maintaining composure under conditions that made composure difficult. "I know Mark said I couldn't come here yet, but I ran out of heating oil 2 days ago. I've been using the oven to keep warm, and I didn't know who else to. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to come like this." The living room was completely silent. Laura was aware, without turning around, of every person in that room. She was aware of Jim Miller setting down his drink. She was aware of Janet Miller's expression shifting from puzzlement to something more alert. She was aware of the Garcias exchanging a glance. She was aware of the Hendersons' teenage son finally looking up from his phone, drawn by the silence. The way teenagers are always drawn by the thing adults don't want them to see. And she was aware of Mark. She did not look at him. She looked at the woman on her porch, this 78-year-old woman standing in the snow with a grocery bag and an apology on her lips. Her feet in shoes that weren't meant for winter sidewalks, having walked however far she'd walked because her apartment had no heat and she didn't know where else to go. "Rose," Laura said, and her voice was steady, absolutely steady, the voice she used with her most frightened clients. The voice that meant you are safe, I have you, nothing bad is going to happen in this moment. Come inside, come in right now. She took the grocery bag from Rose's hand and drew her gently over the threshold, and the warmth of the house wrapped around the old woman, and Rose exhaled, and her shoulders dropped 2 inches. And she looked around at the gathered neighbors with the expression of a woman who has just understood that she has wandered into a situation considerably larger than she intended. "Oh my," Rose said quietly. "I didn't realize I'll just." "You're staying right here," Laura said. "Come sit by the fire." She guided Rose toward the armchair nearest the fireplace and reached for the throw blanket folded over the sofa back. She draped it over Rose's lap and crouched down in front of her, checking her hands cold, but not dangerously so, and asked quietly if she'd eaten. "A little," Rose said. "The crackers. I'll get you something hot in a minute." The room remained very still. The kind of still that a room full of people goes when everyone is pretending not to witness something they absolutely are witnessing. And then Laura stood up, and she turned around. She looked at Mark. He was standing exactly where she'd left him by the fireplace, beside Jim Miller. Though Jim Miller had stepped away with the tactful instinct of a man who understands when a space needs to be cleared. Mark stood alone, his face the color of something that has been drained. His right hand was at his side, the fingers slightly open, as if he'd been holding something and just let it go. He was looking at his mother in the armchair with an expression that Laura could not name. It was too many things at once, compressed into a face that had run out of room for all of them. She held his gaze for a long moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. 23 years of marriage meant that the things that needed to be said had already been said in the space between them, in the 5 seconds it had taken her to look at him from across the room. What she felt moving through her in that moment was not the sharp heat of anger that would come. And it would be considerable, but something colder and in some ways worse. It was the feeling of a structure giving way. The feeling of stepping onto a floor you have trusted for years and finding it is not where you thought it was. The perfect provider. The third Saturdays. The canvas bag and the chicken soup and the crossword puzzles. The facility that had never heard of Rose Sullivan. All of it, in the freezing air that had come in with an old woman through a front door, had become exactly what it was. Jim Miller coughed softly. Someone, Janet, probably murmured something to the Garcias. The room began, carefully and quietly, to rearrange itself around the new reality, the way rooms do when they have witnessed something they cannot unwitness. Laura turned back to Rose and said, "Let me get you some stew." Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. She walked to the kitchen and stood at the stove with her back to the room, and for exactly 4 seconds. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the years of it, the careful architecture of the lie, the old woman in the snow before she picked up the ladle and filled a bowl with something warm. She carried it back to Rose, and she sat beside her, and they ate together by the fire, and the neighbors trickled out over the next hour. With quiet goodbyes and expressions of careful kindness, and Mark stood against the wall like a man waiting to be told what came next. And the snow kept falling outside, patient and indifferent, covering the front path where his mother had walked. The last guest left at 9:17. Laura heard Jim Miller say goodnight at the door, heard the particular note in his voice, careful, subdued, the voice of a man who had witnessed something private in a public setting. And was choosing, gracefully, not to make it more difficult by acknowledging it. She heard the door close. She heard the latch catch. Then the house was silent. Rose had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fire, which had burned down to a steady orange glow. She was tucked under Laura's blanket, her breathing slow and even, her white head tilted slightly to the right. Her hands folded in her lap over the edge of the wool fabric. On the end table beside her, the bowl of beef stew sat empty. The grocery bag she'd arrived with was on the floor next to the chair, the box of crackers still inside, the apples, the orange juice. Beside the grocery bag, Laura had set the eviction notice. She'd found it while clearing the coffee table. It had slid from between the throw pillows, where it must have fallen from Mark's briefcase at some point. The briefcase that sat open against the bookcase with its contents disarranged, as if he'd been through it in a hurry sometime in the chaos of the evening. The notice was on Clover Street Apartments letterhead, formal and unambiguous, informing the tenant that 2 months of unpaid rent had triggered the eviction process and that the premises must be vacated within 30 days. Beside it, she placed the brochures, 3 of them, full color, for Greenbrook Care Facility. The kind of brochures you pick up from a rack in a lobby and carry home to show your family. Dog-eared at the corners. Soft from handling. She'd set them both on the coffee table, next to each other, and stepped back, and looked at them for a moment. Then she'd gone and sat at the kitchen table and waited. Mark came in from the living room at 9:22. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her just for a second, a fraction of a second. The hesitation of a man who has walked into a room and immediately understood what kind of room it is. Then he came in and stood at the counter with his back to the window. And he looked at her, and his face was the face of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. But putting it down means acknowledging how heavy it was, and he wasn't sure, yet, if he could do that. She said nothing. She had learned, over 20 years of counseling, that silence was often the most demanding thing you could ask of another person. He stood at the counter for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the neighborhood was very still, the way it goes still after a snowfall. The world turned soft and white and hushed. She was never at Greenbrook, Laura said finally. Not as a question. His eyes moved to the table, then back to her. No, he said. His voice was low. She wasn't. The apartment on Clover Street. Yes. 3 years. He pressed his lips together. 3 years. She looked at him, really looked at him, and what she saw in his face was not what she'd been steeling herself for. It was not the face of a man caught in a deception he'd wanted to maintain. It was something stripped of that, of all of it, a face that had run out of the energy required to be anything other than what it was. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been maintaining a tremendous and solitary effort for a very long time. And had just watched the effort become futile in the span of 43 minutes. He looked, she thought, with a complicated feeling she hadn't expected, like someone who was relieved. "Mark," she said. He walked past her, into the living room. She followed. He stopped when he saw his mother in the armchair. He stood at the edge of the room, taking in the scene: the sleeping woman, the blanket, the empty bowl, the eviction notice on the coffee table, the brochures beside it. He looked at each thing in turn, slowly, the way you look at the accumulated evidence of something you have done and cannot now undo. His face did something then that she had not seen it do in a long time. He went to his knees. Not slowly, not with deliberation the way a man's legs give when the thing he's been holding up finally lets go. He crossed the room and went down at his mother's feet, and his shoulders came forward, and the sound that came out of him was not quite a word at the beginning, it was something below words. Something that had been compressed for 3 years under the weight of third Saturdays and monthly cash withdrawals. And a lie that had grown so large it had become the load-bearing structure of his entire self-presentation. Rose opened her eyes. She looked down at her son at her feet. She did not startle. She did not exclaim. She had the quality of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this, not with impatience, not with judgment, but with the particular patience of someone who understood that it was going to happen eventually and had simply kept herself ready. "Mom." His voice was raw. I went to that place and I stood in the lobby and I saw what it was going to look like, and I couldn't." He stopped. Pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. "I couldn't look at you and see death, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't." Rose reached down. She put her hand on the top of his head, the way she must have done when he was very small. The gesture so natural and complete that it required nothing added to it. She held her hand there, and she didn't say anything for a moment. And the fire gave one last low pulse of orange light, and the room held very still around all three of them. "Mark," she said softly. He couldn't speak. "Look at me." He lifted his face. His eyes were wet. He looked, and this was the thought that moved through Laura as she stood in the doorway between the rooms. Like a man who had just understood the difference between protecting someone and hiding from them, and was discovering that the two things, from the inside, can feel exactly the same. "I know," Rose said. The house around them, the house that had been a symbol, in the way that houses become symbols, of success and stability. And the careful management of appearances felt different now. Not smaller, but honest, in the way that things are honest when they've been stripped of the effort required to make them look like something they're not. The unopened mail on the entryway table. The bills behind the recipe binders. The unpaid rent notice on the coffee table. The brochures that had been carried back and forth for 3 years without ever being used. Laura leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. She did not go in. Not yet. This was not her moment. This was theirs, mother and son, 78 years of one life and 52 years of the other, meeting each other. Finally, without the buffer of the story Mark had constructed between them. She watched Rose keep her hand on her son's head. She watched Mark Sullivan stop running. The house was quiet. The fire was low. Outside, the snow sat deep and white on the front path and the garden beds and the roof of the car in the driveway, covering everything with the temporary, impractical kindness of things that don't last, and the night pressed close against the windows, and inside. Something that had been held very tight for a very long time slowly, in the space of a single room, began to open. "Friends, thank you for staying with us through these first 4 sequences. We've watched Mark Sullivan carry a secret so heavy it became his whole life, the third Saturdays. The empty bank statements, the cold apartment on Clover Street where his mother waited alone. And we've watched Laura, steady and quiet, follow the paper trail to a truth she hadn't wanted to find. And tonight, in that living room, with his mother's hand on his head and the evidence laid out on the coffee table, the walls finally came down. But here's what none of them know yet, not Laura, not even Mark, why Rose stayed silent for 3 years. What she saw, what she understood, and what that knowledge is about to change in each of them. Stay with us. The hardest part of this story is also its most beautiful part. It's just ahead. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in early November, Rose Sullivan stood at the window of apartment 2B on Clover Street and watched her son sit in his car in the parking lot below for 51 minutes. She knew the car. She had watched it pull in too slowly, The way Mark drove when he was thinking hard about something and park in the far corner of the lot, away from the other cars. Nose facing out, the way he always parked when he felt he might need to leave quickly. She had watched him cut the engine. She had watched him sit. She had not gone down. She had made a cup of tea instead, and she had sat in the chair by the window with it. And she had kept her eyes on the dark shape of the car in the lot below while the afternoon went cold around her. While the other tenants came and went through the building's main entrance, while the November light went from gray to the particular amber of late afternoon, and the car did not move. She thought about the look on his face the morning he'd brought her here. He had tried to hide it. He was always trying to hide things from her. He'd been doing it since he was 11 years old, when he'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and spent 3 days conducting an elaborate and completely transparent performance of normalcy. Until the guilt became too much and he'd confessed before she'd even asked. He had never been as good at hiding things as he believed. But she had always let him think otherwise, because there is a kind of protection that a mother extends to her child. That is not about shielding them from consequences but about preserving their belief in their own competence. And she had extended it to Mark for 52 years with the patience and consistency of someone who understood that it was part of what love required. The car stayed in the lot. She had known, when he'd shown her the apartment on Clover Street, what was happening. It wasn't difficult to understand. She had watched him during the previous 6 months, the way he avoided looking at her directly. The way he changed the subject when she mentioned feeling tired. The way he responded to the word doctor with a particular tension around his jaw that he controlled almost entirely but not quite. She was a retired teacher who had spent 31 years reading the faces of people who were telling her something other than what they were saying. She was also his mother. She knew what he saw when he looked at her. He saw the years. He saw the accumulation of small losses, the knee that needed replacing, the morning stiffness. The afternoon naps that had become necessary rather than occasional. He saw the chairlift he'd installed at her previous apartment, and the pill organizer. And the fall she'd had in September that she'd told him about too honestly. He saw all of it gathered into a shape he could not look at directly, because the shape it made was a future he was not prepared to enter. And Mark Sullivan had never been able to make peace with the things he could not manage. He had always believed that love was a form of control. Not cruelty, the opposite of cruelty. Love is arrangement. Love is provision. Love is the careful management of circumstances to prevent the people you cared for from being exposed to anything you couldn't fix. She had watched him build that belief into every structure of his adult life, his career, his marriage, his house, his third Saturdays. She had watched it serve him well, up to a point. She had watched the point approach for 2 years now. The car finally moved at 4:50. It reversed out of the far corner of the lot and drove slowly to the exit and turned right, toward home, and the parking lot was empty where it had been. Rose watched it go. She could have gone down. She could have walked out the building's main entrance and stood in the lot and waited for him to see her in the rearview mirror and stopped him. She could have called him, or written him a letter, or found some way to say, I know what you're doing, and you don't have to do it this way. She hadn't, because she understood with the long, practiced comprehension of a woman who had raised him, and buried a husband, and taught 3 decades of other people's children, and learned the hard way that there are things that cannot be forced into readiness, that Mark needed to arrive at the truth on his own schedule. That arriving at it on someone else's schedule would only produce shame without understanding. And shame without understanding, in her experience, produced nothing useful. It only drove things deeper. So she had stayed. She had let him bring the soup and the crossword puzzles. She had let him sit with her for 2 hours every third Saturday and pretend. And she had pretended with him, because sometimes love means meeting someone in the fiction they need until they're ready to step out of it. But she had also run out of heating oil. And the apartment had been cold for 2 days. And she was 78 years old, and she was tired of being cold, and whatever else was true, she was still his mother, and she knew where he lived. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Mark stopped crying. Laura had made tea a practical, quiet act, something to do with her hands that was also genuinely useful, because the night had arrived in earnest now. And the house needed warmth that the dying fire was no longer providing. She carried 3 mugs to the living room and set them on the coffee table on top of the eviction notice. she realized, and shifted it gently aside. And the small gesture felt, in the moment, like something more than housekeeping. Rose was sitting up now, more alert, her hands wrapped around her mug. Mark sat on the floor with his back against the armchair's leg, his mug untouched on the table, his forearms resting on his knees. The posture of a man who has been thoroughly hollowed out and is waiting, quietly, to understand what he is now. Laura sat on the sofa and said nothing. It was Rose who spoke first, and when she did, it was not with the voice of a woman delivering a verdict. It was the voice Laura associated with her client's most important moments, when the thing that needed to be said had been carried long enough and was finally ready to be set down. "Mark," Rose said, "look at me." He looked up. "I knew you were sitting in that car by the lake." She said it simply, without drama. "I saw you once. I recognized the car. You were parked by the far end of the path, where the bench is, the one that faces the water." Mark went very still. "I watched from the road when I was walking back from the pharmacy," she said. "I almost went over, and then I thought, no. He's doing what he needs to do." And I kept walking. A long silence. The last of the embers in the grate breathed their red. "You knew," he said. The words came out stripped of everything, no protest, no defense, just the bare fact, arriving late. "I knew." He pressed his eyes shut briefly. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it," she said. "And because I understood why you were sitting in that car." She set her mug on the table and folded her hands in her lap. And she looked at her son with the particular expression of a woman who has had a long time to arrange her thoughts on a subject. "I know what you see when you look at me," she said. "I know what the pill organizer means to you. And the knee, and the fall last September. I know you look at all of it and you see something coming that you don't know how to prepare for. That's not a flaw in you, Mark. That's love. It's just love that got turned the wrong direction." Mark's jaw was working, but he didn't speak. "I stayed away because I didn't want to be the weight that broke you," she said. "I want you to hear that. I made a choice to stay in that apartment because I thought if I give him more time, maybe he finds his way through it. Maybe he comes home one day and says, 'Mom, I need you to come home.' And I wanted that to be on your terms. Not because I forced it." Laura was watching this from the sofa, watching an old woman dismantle, with plain and careful words, the story that her husband had been telling himself for 3 years. Not to exonerate him, not to assign blame, but to reframe the thing at the center of it, to strip away the version of events in which Mark Sullivan was a man deceiving his family out of avoidance, and replace it with the version that was also true. A man who loved his mother so much that he could not bear to participate in what he experienced as her diminishment, and had hidden both of them from that truth in the only way he could manage. She had come in tonight angry. She was still angry. There was a part of her that remained cold in. Clear-eyed about the 3 years, the missing payments, the neighbors in the living room, the old woman on the porch in the snow. That part would need its own time. She was not pretending it wasn't there. But what she was also feeling now, and it arrived with the disorienting quality of something that changes the landscape. While you're standing in it was something softer than anger. An understanding that the lie hadn't been the shape she'd assumed. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for a story about deception that was at its root about something else. Something human. Something genuinely sad. It wasn't another woman. It wasn't greed. It wasn't the thing I was afraid it was. It was a son who couldn't watch his mother age. It was a grown man sitting in a car by a lake every 3rd Saturday because he needed somewhere to put the grief he couldn't bring home. She set her mug down. "Mark," she said. He turned to look at her, and his face was open in a way she hadn't seen in years. Scraped clean of the management and the arrangement and the provision, all the scaffolding gone. "We have to figure this out," she said. "All of it. The money, the house, what comes next. We have to do it together and we have to do it honestly." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to be here for that. Present. No more 3rd Saturdays where you go somewhere else." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I know." Rose reached over and picked up her mug and took a slow sip of her tea, and the 3 of them sat together in the warm quiet of the room, the fire gone now. But the heat of it still present in the walls, in the air, in the space between 3 people who were, for the first time in a long time, in exactly the same room. The first lawyer they met with was a woman named Patricia Adime, whose office was on the 4th floor of a downtown Naperville building with a view of the river path below. She had the manner of someone who had heard a great many family situations, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them, which Laura found reassuring. Patricia listened to what they laid out: the 3 years, the apartment, the frozen accounts, the cash withdrawals, the Greenbrook brochures that had never been used, with a legal pad in front of her and a pen she didn't pick up until they were finished. Then she asked her questions, and they answered them, and at the end of the meeting she set her pen down and looked at the 3 of them across the desk: Mark and Laura and Rose, all 3 of them present. Which had been Laura's condition from the beginning, and said that the situation was workable, and complicated, and that they would need to make some significant decisions before they left the building today. The first decision was the house. Mark looked at the table when Patricia said it. Laura looked at Mark. "The debt structure you're describing," Patricia said, in her even, informational way. "The back rent, the medical expenses you've been covering out of pocket, the bills that have been deferred. This isn't a situation you can service on your current income while maintaining the mortgage. The numbers don't support it." "I know," Mark said. "The equity in the property would cover the existing debt and give you a foundation to work from. A smaller property, something more practical for 3 people, would allow you to redirect those resources toward your mother's actual needs." Rose, sitting beside Mark, said nothing. She was looking at the river through the window. "How do you feel about that?" Laura asked her, quietly. Rose turned from the window. "About the house?" She considered it for a moment, with the unhurried thoughtfulness of a woman who has already done her grieving about certain things and has arrived on the other side. "I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment for 31 years while your father was with us. I raised Mark in less space than your living room." A small pause. "A house is what it contains, Laura, not what it costs." Mark made a sound beside her that was not quite a word. Patricia gave them 2 weeks. The decision was already made. The house on Willowbrook Drive sold in 11 days, faster than anyone expected, snapped up by a couple from out of state who didn't negotiate on price. The number, when it came through, was enough. Enough to settle the back rent on Clover Street. Enough to clear the accumulated deferments and the medical bills, and the various small debts that had been gathering in the margins of their life like water finding low ground. When the accounts were settled and the balance calculated, they had enough left over for a down payment on a modest ranch style on the east side of town, single story, 3 bedrooms. A backyard with a concrete patio and 2 mature maples that would be worth something in summer. The guardianship hearing was 3 weeks after the sale. It was a brief proceeding, family court, low on drama, high on paperwork. Judge Carla Weston was a compact woman with reading glasses on a beaded cord, who reviewed the application with the focused efficiency of someone who processes these matters regularly and takes them seriously. Laura had worked with a social worker named Diane to prepare the documentation. Everything was in order: the financial disclosure, the care plan, the medical records, the letters of support from Rose's physician. When Judge Weston looked up from the file and asked if anyone had anything to add before she signed, Rose leaned forward slightly in her chair and said, with characteristic precision, "I'd like the record to show that this is consensual. I want to be here." Judge Weston looked at her over the reading glasses for a moment. "So noted," she said, and signed. They stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the thin January light. Mark was holding the folder of documents. Laura had her arm through Rose's. The cold was sharp but not brutal, the kind of winter cold that is bracing rather than punishing, and the sky was a clear, depthless blue. "How do you feel?" Laura asked. "Hungry," Rose said. "Can we get lunch?" Mark made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale and something that didn't quite have a name. He put the folder under his arm and looked out at the street. The city moved around them, cars and pedestrians and a cyclist navigating the bike lane with dedicated caution, all of it indifferent and ongoing, the ordinary world proceeding exactly as it always did, which was, in this moment, its own strange comfort. "There's a diner on Jefferson," he said. "Mom, you'd like it. They still do the crossword on the paper placemats." "Then that's where we're going," Rose said. They walked down the steps together. At the new account they'd opened a joint household account, all 3 names, the statements going to Laura's email and a paper copy to Rose's bedside table, every transaction visible and agreed upon. The first month's balance was modest but real. The nursing home fund that had been designated and never used was redirected to its actual purpose: Rose's doctor visits, her medications. The occasional taxi on days the weather was too much for walking. The arrangements were straightforward. They were also honest, which was the thing they had not been before. And the difference between the two turned out to matter more than the dollar amount of any individual item. The new house smelled of fresh paint and the previous owner's cleaning supplies when they first walked through it. The rooms were smaller than what they'd had on Willowbrook. The hallway was narrower. The kitchen was efficient rather than generous. But there were 3 bedrooms, one with a south-facing window that got the afternoon light, which they gave to Rose without discussion, and the backyard had a good flat surface for the folding table they'd bring out in spring, and the nearest neighbor was a retired music teacher named Gerald, who had waved from his driveway on the day they came to sign the paperwork and had immediately made Laura think of her mother-in-law. On the afternoon they moved the piano in a 40-year-old upright that had lived in storage since Rose's previous apartment proved too small for it, retrieved at some effort and considerable cost that they had nonetheless agreed was non-negotiable. Mark stood in the small living room, watching 2 movers navigate the instrument through the front door with a professionalism that made it look easier than it was. Rose stood in the hallway with her arms folded, supervising. "Left," she said. "No, left. The other left." "Mom," Mark said. "I know what I'm saying." The piano cleared the doorframe with an inch to spare and settled against the interior wall. And Rose walked over and sat down on the bench that had been the last thing off the truck, and she placed her hands on the keys. She didn't play immediately. She just sat with her hands resting there, feeling the familiarity of the ivory under her fingertips. And the movers gathered their moving blankets, and Mark stood in the center of the room, and Laura leaned in the doorway from the kitchen. Rose pressed a single note. It rang out in the small room, clean and clear and completely itself. "Good," she said. It held the tuning. It was the 3rd Saturday of January. Mark woke with the alarm. Not because he'd forgotten to set it, he'd set it the night before with the same deliberate attention he'd always brought to Saturday mornings, the muscle memory of 3 years running so deep that doing things differently still required a kind of active intention. But this Saturday, when the alarm went off at 6:50, he reached over and turned it off and lay in the quiet for exactly 2 minutes, just to feel the difference. To notice it, to let it be what it was instead of what it used to be. Then he got up and went to the kitchen. The new kitchen was smaller than the one on Willowbrook. The counters were a plain laminate rather than the quartz Laura had loved, and the cabinet handles were the original ones from the previous owners. Brass poles that had gone slightly out of fashion but functioned perfectly well. The window above the sink looked out onto the backyard and the 2 maple trees, their bare branches still against the early morning white. Last night's snowfall had been light, less than an inch, and it sat undisturbed on the patio table and along the fence line and across the top of the storage shed in the corner. Mark filled the kettle. He listened to it heat. The house was still, not the heavy, held stillness of Willowbrook on a 3rd Saturday. The stillness of a house where the people inside it are bracing, or hiding, or waiting for something they can't name. This was a different quality of stillness. Lighter. The kind that exists because everyone is simply asleep and the day hasn't begun yet, and there is nothing suppressed in it, nothing maintained. He set the table for 3. He moved carefully in the small kitchen, reaching around each other's absence, a kind of choreography. He was still learning the spatial vocabulary of a household reconfigured, setting out the white plates they'd kept from the old house, the ones Laura had picked up at a craft fair years ago, each one slightly uneven at the rim in the way of handmade things. 3 of them. He lined up the forks, straightened the paper napkins, moved the sugar bowl to the center. Small adjustments. The accumulated grammar of a family morning. He was scrambling eggs when he heard it. A single note from the living room. Then a pause. Then a second note, and a third, and the slow deliberate feeling out of a melody that knows itself, but hasn't been played in a long time, like a language that lives in the hands, that the hands remember before the mind catches up. He turned the flame down on the eggs and stood listening. The tune was something he recognized from childhood, not a formal piece. Not something with a name he could have told you, but a melody his mother had played on Sunday mornings when he was small. Something she'd composed herself or learned from her own mother, the kind of music that exists only in the private interior of a family's life, passed down. Not through recordings or sheet music but through the simple fact of being heard often enough that it becomes part of you without your noticing. He stood at the stove and listened to her play it. Her fingers were slower than they used to be. He could hear the slight hesitation before certain intervals. The careful approach to the notes that used to arrive automatically, before the arthritis. But the melody was there. Underneath the hesitation, the melody was fully, completely there. She knew every note of it. She had always known every note of it. The fingers remember what the body forgets, he thought. And then he thought, she's been in there. All this time, she's been in there. He turned back to the eggs. Laura came into the kitchen at 7:15 in her robe. Her hair loose, carrying the small notebook she kept on her nightstand for the things she thought of in the morning before they slipped away. She stopped in the doorway and listened for a moment, the piano still going, unhurried. Finding its way through the melody, and then she came to the counter and poured herself coffee and stood beside Mark and didn't say anything. He slid a portion of eggs onto each plate. She remembered the tuning, Laura said. The movers were good. Mark. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression he had been relearning over the past 2 months. Not the managed expression of a woman keeping her own counsel in a household where counsel was necessary, but the open one. The real one. The one she'd had when they first met, in the faculty lounge of a school where she'd been substitute teaching. And he'd wandered in looking for the copy machine, and she'd laughed at his expression of total bewilderment at the toner situation. And the sound of her laugh had been so immediate and unguarded that he had stood there looking at her like a man who has just understood what he wants. He had been working, these past weeks, on the project of deserving that expression again. "How are you?" she asked. It was a question she asked him differently now than she had before. Before, it had been a domestic check-in, the small conversational maintenance of a household. Now it was a real question. She wanted to know. She had made it clear, in the work they'd begun together with a therapist named Drive Erica Brennan, that she wanted to know, and that she was capable of receiving the honest answer. And that she would prefer it to the managed one even when the honest one was harder. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm actually okay." She looked at him for a moment, reading it. "Good," she said. The piano continued in the next room. A simple tune, but her fingers remembered the rhythm. Laura wrapped both hands around her mug and moved to the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, looking into the small living room, where Rose sat at the piano with her back straight and her head slightly tilted, the way she always tilted it when she played, as if she were listening to something just beyond the audible range of everyone else in the room. The morning light came through the south-facing window and lay across the piano's surface and along the edge of Rose's white hair. And the room was plain and small and full of it. Laura watched them. She watched her husband, 52 years old, a man who had nearly broken 3 people under the weight of his love, set a plate of eggs on the table with careful hands. She watched him pause by the kitchen door and listen to his mother play. She watched his face do what faces do when the thing you've been afraid to lose is right there in the room with you and nothing is hiding it. She thought a house is what it contains. She thought, we are starting over. This is what starting over looks like. Not the big gesture, the table set for 3. The coffee before anyone asked. The piano remembered. Starting over wasn't about moving back. It wasn't about restoring what had been lost or reconstructing the version of the life they'd had before the cracks appeared. It was something quieter than that and, in some ways, more. It was about building something that had the honesty in it that the previous version had been missing, the uncomfortable, load-bearing, absolutely necessary honesty that allows people to live with each other as they actually are, rather than as they've agreed to pretend to be. Outside, the snow sat clean and undisturbed on the patio and the maple trees and the fence line. The January sun had just crested the roofline of the neighbor's house, and the light it cast was not the blinding flat winter light of early morning, but something warmer, more angled, the kind of light that suggests the season is a long way from finished but is, nonetheless, in some fundamental sense, turning. For the first time in years, the Saturday sun felt warm instead of blinding. Rose played through the melody once, and then began it again from the top. Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with it myself, and what keeps coming back to me is this: Mark Sullivan didn't set out to hurt anyone. He set out to love his mother in the only way he knew how, which was to manage things so perfectly that no one, including himself, would have to feel the weight of what was coming. And in doing that, he ended up carrying it entirely alone, for 3 years, in a car by a lake on third Saturdays. That image stays with me. What this story tells us, I think, is something most of us already know, but find genuinely difficult to practice: that the people who love us cannot help us carry what we refuse to show them. That the life we protect by hiding the truth is not, in the end, a life that belongs to anyone. And that real home, the kind that actually holds, isn't built from success or status or the appearance of having everything arranged correctly. It's built from the courage to say, this is where I'm failing. I need you to know. I need to stop doing this alone. Rose Sullivan waited 3 years for her son to find his way back. She did it with grace and patience and an understanding of human nature that only comes from long practice. And Laura Sullivan, who could have met betrayal with coldness and chosen to leave, chose instead to follow the truth wherever it led, even when it led somewhere more complicated and more tender than anger. That is its own kind of courage. We don't always get to choose our hardships, but we do get to choose what we do with them. We get to choose whether the difficulty closes us or opens us. I hope this story brought you something meaningful today. If it reminded you of someone, or something you've been carrying alone, you don't have to keep sitting in that parking lot. The table can be set for 3. Please subscribe, and hit that like button. It means more than you know, and it helps us keep bringing you stories worth telling. We'll see you next time.